refashioning my jacket. Follow along to see how I did it, or if you want the short and sweet version, check out my project at jonesinthemaking.com. To begin, I decided on how much I wanted to remove from the current sleeve. After a little visual analysis, I decided that 7 inches would be a good amount for this jacket. So I measured it out and I used a water-soluble pen to mark it all the way around. Then I cut about a 1/2 inch up from that line. So not on the line, but a 1/2 inch up from it, I cut in order to leave a seam allowance. And then I did that on the other sleeve. Now that everything is cut, I needed to make an anchor row. So what I did was, using embroidery floss, I created a row of chain stitches along that line that I drew out. And I made them about 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch long, and I ended up, for this sleeve, having 40 chain stitches going across. So the decision to make them that size was based on the fact that I was going to be using a super bulky weight yarn, so I needed the chain stitches to be a little bigger. If you are going to use a worsted weight or a finer yarn, obviously you would want to make your chain stitches a little smaller. So here I kept them bigger, and I just worked a chain stitch all the way around. And the only thing that I did differently was, every time I needed to add another piece of embroidery floss, I would tie the knots on the back and then I reinforce them with PROEJECT or glue, just to give an extra security there. And I did that to both sleeves. So here's what it ended up looking like at this point. And I had 40 stitches going around. And my next step was to sew down the seam allowance. I folded the sleeve so that the chain stitch would be directly on the edge of the sleeve. And I pinned it down and then sewed around each sleeve. And then, since this fabric was stretchy, I did make sure to use a stretching stitch on my machine as I went around. It makes everything easier. And here you can see how it ended up with the chain stitch on the very outer edge, which is what I wanted. Now I went to a cozy spot and started in with my crocheting. To begin, I started by crocheting a row of slip stitches across the row of chain stitching. And because my yarn was so heavy, I had to skip a stitch in between each slip stitch. So I skipped one chain stitch and then created a slip stitch in the next chain stitch. And I did that all the way around. While I was doing this slip stitch row, I also wanted to be very careful not to make the stitches too tight and to keep them a bit loose so that the sleeve wouldn't bunch up in the end. So just a little note on that. Then when I got to the end of the slip stitch row, I turned my work and chain 1, and then I began my single crochet, and I just did simple single crochets all the way across both loops of the slip stitch. This project would be very easy to just work in the round. And if that was the case, then you would want to mark the first stitch just to keep track of your rows. But other than that, you're just going to crochet back and forth, single crochet, all the stitches. Very simple, very calming, quick little project. There's my friend. He wanted to lay down, but then he didn't. So he just stood there for a while and watched me. Okay, so we're coming to the end of the single crochets for the sleeve. And I'm going to pull up a longer piece, a longer tail, and then pull it through the loops. Put my yarn needle on that tail, and then I'm gonna sew the seam up. And again, if you did it in the round, obviously you need to skip this step. So when I'm sewing the seam, I am using the sides of the stitches, and I'm going to go down the front, and I'm going to be sewing together the front loops of each stitch only. And you can kind of see there, and some of it you got to fiddle with, but you want to try to keep all the rows lined up. And just work your way all the way down to the end. And then when you get to the bottom of the crocheted section, you're going to feed the yarn in the end there back into the inside. I'm sorry, my camera angle there is really bad. And then you're going to work your way back up the sleeve in the same manner, but just doing the back loops only. And then you're going to weave in the ends. So I wanted to make an edge, but I didn't want it to be, too intricate or fancy. I wanted to keep this whole thing a bit understated. So I decided to wrap yarn around the last row of single stitches, or single crochet, sorry. And I just went through the front and the back loops of the last row, and I whipped it around, I don't know, 2 or 3 times each stitch. It just varied a little bit, but mostly 2, but sometimes I did add an extra one just to try to keep it consistent and not have any gaps in the wrapping. And I just did that all the way around. And if you didn't see before when I started this wrapping, I I actually brought the yarn in about an inch or two below the top edge and then came over, wrapped it. And then here you'll see that as I finish up that row, I will feed it back down an inch or two to meet the yarn that I started, where I started. And then I will weave in the ends down there just to keep the woven ends away from the actual edge of your jacket sleeve. And there it is. If you have any questions, comment below. And if you'd like, take a look at the blog post at jonesandthemaking.com. Bye.